Imagine standing behind walls so thick, so formidable, that the entire world calls them the Gibraltar of the East. You are surrounded by massive 15-inch naval guns pointed out to sea, each one capable of hurling a nearly 1-ton shell over 20 miles. Military strategists have declared this fortress absolutely impregnable. The British Empire itself has proclaimed that these walls will never fall. You are told, with absolute certainty, that you are safe. But what if safety was always an illusion? What if the enemy you were watching for never came from the direction you were looking? In February 1942, the unthinkable happened. The jungle itself seemed to come alive with a sound no one had ever heard before, a metallic rattling, like 1,000 chains being dragged across stone, growing louder by the hour. The massive guns, those symbols of imperial might, sat uselessly pointing at an empty sea while the enemy poured down from the north. Like a flood, they didn't come in tanks or armored vehicles. They came on bicycles, thousands upon thousands of them, riding through rubber plantations and dense jungle on bare metal rims, creating a sound that would echo through history and, according to some, never truly stopped. Sometimes the ghosts we fear most are born from our own arrogance, from the hubris of believing ourselves untouchable. And when that arrogance shatters in a matter of days, when an empire's crown jewel falls faster than anyone thought possible, the spiritual wound left behind never fully heals. Welcome back to Ghost Stories of the Battles, where we unearth the spectral remnants of history's darkest conflicts. If you are fascinated by the paranormal echoes of war, if you believe that the most violent chapters of our past leave permanent scars on the land itself, you are in the right place. Let me set the stage for you. It is February 1942. Singapore is the crown jewel of the British Empire in Southeast Asia, a gleaming symbol of Western dominance in the East. The city is home to the largest British military base east of Suez, protected by those legendary coastal guns and defended by 85,000 Commonwealth troops. Everyone from London to Singapore itself believes the fortress is, quite literally, invincible. Winston Churchill has even publicly declared it the Gibraltar of the East, a comparison that carries the weight of centuries of British naval supremacy. But on the Malayan Peninsula, something unprecedented is happening. The Japanese military has launched what historians would later call a bicycle blitz. While the world expected a slow, grinding campaign, Japanese forces are racing down the peninsula on thousands of bicycles, covering ground at a speed that defies every military projection. When their tires blow out from the rough terrain, they don't stop. They simply ride on the metal rims. The sound is unholy, a screeching, clattering cacophony that British and Australian defenders report can be heard for miles. It sounds like an approaching tank division, but it is something far more terrifying, an enemy that requires no fuel, no supply lines, just the relentless determination of thousands of soldiers pedaling toward their objective. In just 70 days, the Japanese sweep down the entire length of Malaya. On the 31st of January, the last Commonwealth forces retreat across the causeway to Singapore Island and blow the bridge behind them. But it is too late. The invaders have already achieved what Churchill thought impossible. They've gotten behind those massive coastal guns. On the 8th of February, Japanese forces cross the Johor Strait and pour onto Singapore Island itself. What follows is chaos. The defensive lines crumble. The city's water supply is cut. Fires rage through the urban center. And on the 15th of February, 1942, just 1 week after the invasion of the island began, British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walks into a meeting with Japanese General Yamashita Tomoyuki and signs the surrender. In that single moment, 130,000 Allied defenders, British, Australian, Indian, and Malayan troops, lay down their arms. It is the largest surrender in British military history. Churchill, devastated, calls it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The impregnable fortress has fallen in less than a week, but when an empire falls in a matter of days, when violence and terror compress into such a concentrated period, the sudden shock leaves a permanent scar on the land. The emotional energy of that terror, that panic, that death, it doesn't just dissipate. According to those who've experienced it firsthand, it remains imprinted on the physical space like a recording that never stops playing. Our first story takes us to the sweltering, humid borders of the city, where the sound of the invasion has never truly stopped echoing. Story 1. The Phantom Blitz. Before we begin, let me tell you about one of the most psychologically devastating tactics of the Malayan campaign. The Japanese bicycle infantry wasn't just a logistical innovation. It was a weapon of terror. Imagine you are a British or Australian soldier stationed along a jungle road in Malaya. You've been told the enemy is hundreds of miles away, that you have weeks, maybe months before any real confrontation. The jungle around you is thick, impenetrable. The road is the only clear path, and you are watching it. Then, in the distance, you hear something. It starts as a faint metallic rattling, almost like rain on a tin roof, but it grows, and grows within minutes. It sounds like a mechanized division approaching, the screech and clatter of metal on stone, echoing through the trees. Your commanders scramble, shouting that tanks are coming, that you need to fall back to prepared positions. But they're not tanks. When the sound rounds the bend, you see them, thousands of soldiers on bicycles, their tires long since shredded, riding on bare metal rims. The noise is deafening. They're moving faster than you thought possible, and they're not stopping. Some are pedaling with rifles slung across their backs. Others have wheels that are so damaged, they're practically riding on mangled wire. But still they come. The psychological impact was profound. Defenders reported feeling hunted, overwhelmed. The sound itself became a harbinger of defeat. Once you heard that metallic clattering, you knew the line was about to break. Some 50,000 bicycles were used in the campaign, and their riders covered ground that military planners thought would take weeks to traverse. They moved through jungle, down roads, even through rubber plantations, relentless and unstoppable. And according to dozens of witnesses over the decades since 1942, that sound never truly stopped. Marcus Chen had always considered himself a rational person. As a 34-year-old software engineer from San Jose who'd relocated to Singapore for work, he approached life with the methodical logic of someone who spent their days debugging code, ghosts, spirits, the paranormal. All of that was, in his view, just pattern recognition gone wrong. The human brain looking for meaning in random noise. That is why when his Singaporean colleagues warned him about hiking near the old Bukit Timah area at dusk, he'd laughed it off. Spirits of the invasion, they'd said. The Japanese soldiers still riding through the jungle. Come on, Marcus had replied, grinning. You really believe that? His colleague Sarah had given him a look that wasn't quite joking. I am just saying, people hear things up there, especially near the old battle sites. Maybe just don't go alone at sunset. But Marcus had a long weekend. His hiking boots were gathering dust in his closet, and he wanted to explore the famed Bukit Timah Nature Reserve before the oppressive heat of Singapore's summer truly set in. Besides, sunset was the only time he could go. He worked late during the week, and the idea of hiking in the afternoon heat was madness. So on a Saturday in late February, almost exactly 80 years after the invasion, Marcus set out on the Rifle Range Link Trail around 5:30 p.m. The reserve was beautiful, lush, green, with towering dipterocarp trees forming a canopy overhead. The modern trail was well maintained, but periodically he'd see old concrete pillboxes half consumed by vegetation. Remnants of the desperate defensive line that had failed to stop the Japanese advance. Marcus paused at one such pillbox, running his hand over the pitted concrete. Bullet holes, maybe, or just decades of tropical weathering. He pulled out his phone and took a few pictures. The light was already fading. The sun set fast in Singapore, dropping like a stone once it got close to the horizon. He checked the time, 6:15 p.m. He should probably head back. The trail he was on looped back to the main path, but he'd wandered a bit off the marked route to examine the pillbox. No big deal, he could see the way back. That is when he noticed the silence. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was the complete absence of sound. The cicadas that had been creating their usual deafening chorus had simply stopped. No birds, no rustling in the undergrowth, even the distant traffic noise from the road. A constant background hum inland. Scarce Singapore had vanished. Marcus stood still, his phone still in his hand. Something felt wrong. The air itself seemed to have changed. The oppressive humidity that had been making his shirt stick to his back suddenly lifted, replaced by a cool, almost cold breeze that made no sense in tropical Singapore. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding flat and strange in the dead air. "Anyone there?" Nothing, just that profound, oppressive silence. He started walking back toward the main trail, his hiking boots crunching loudly on the gravel path. Each footstep seemed absurdly loud in the quiet. His heart was beating faster now, though he told himself he was being ridiculous. It was just a quiet moment in the jungle. Animals went silent all the time when predators were near. That thought didn't comfort him as much as he'd hoped. He was 50 yards from the main trail when he heard it. At first, it was so faint he thought he was imagining it. A distant sound, rhythmic, metallic, like someone dragging a chain across pavement, but not quite. It had a clicking quality to it, a rattling, and it was getting louder. Marcus froze. The sound was coming from the north, from deeper in the jungle, from the direction of the old Kranji area where the Japanese had first crossed onto Singapore Island. It sounded like it was moving, sweeping toward him through the trees. His rational mind tried to catalog it. Machinery, some kind of maintenance vehicle. But there were no roads in that direction, and the sound was wrong for an engine. It was too irregular, too organic almost, like hundreds of individual metal objects, all clicking together in a horrible rhythm. The temperature dropped further. Marcus could see his breath now, a visible mist in the tropical evening air. That wasn't possible. It was easily 85 degrees even after sunset. But he was watching his own breath fog in front of his face. The metallic rattling grew louder. Now it sounded like it was coming from multiple directions, sweeping through the jungle on either side of him. The clicking, screeching sound echoed off the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. But it was close, very close. Marcus started walking faster, his eyes darting between the darkening trees. The light was fading fast now, too fast. It felt like someone was dimming the world, pulling a curtain of shadow across the jungle. Then he smelled it, old canvas, sweat, gun oil, that distinctive, acrid smell of old military equipment mixed with human perspiration. It was overwhelming, cutting through the normal jungle scent of earth and vegetation. "This isn't real," Marcus said aloud, his voice shaking. "This is not real." But the sound was all around him now, that terrible metallic clattering, so loud it seemed to be vibrating in his chest. And beneath it he could hear something else, the sound of heavy breathing, of whispered commands in a language he didn't understand, of equipment jingling and creaking. Marcus broke into a run. The main trail was just ahead. He could see the marker post in the gloom. 20 more yards, 15. 10. The sound was deafening now, a shrieking metallic cacophony directly behind him. He could feel the cold at his back, like someone had opened a freezer door. His lungs burned as he sprinted, his boots slipping on loose gravel, 5 yards from the trail marker. He made the mistake of looking back. They were there, shapes moving through the jungle, but wrong, all wrong. Shadows that didn't match the fading light, silhouettes of men on bicycles that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. They were riding directly through the undergrowth, through thorns, through thick vegetation, through spaces too narrow for a bicycle to pass. The bikes themselves looked skeletal, their wheels mangled and warped, no tires at all, just twisted metal rims screeching against stone and earth. The riders were worse. Their faces were obscured by shadows that seemed too deep, too dark. But Marcus could see their uniforms, the strange shape of their helmets, the rifles strapped to their backs. They were pedaling with mechanical intensity, never slowing, never stopping, their legs pumping in perfect rhythm. And they were looking at him. One of the riders, close enough that Marcus could have reached out and touched him, turned its head. Where the face should have been was just darkness, a void. But Marcus felt the weight of its gaze, felt the intensity of purpose, the relentless drive to keep moving, to reach the city, to complete the mission. The rider opened its mouth, or the void where a mouth should have been opened, and Marcus heard a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from very far away and very close all at once, it spoke. Tatsu. The word meant nothing to Marcus, but he felt its meaning in his bones. Breakthrough. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root, and fell hard onto the trail. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He lay there, gasping, staring up at the canopy as the metallic clattering sound grew to a crescendo. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different, natural. Within seconds, the cicadas started up again. A bird called from a nearby tree. The humid warmth of the evening flooded back in, soaking through his shirt. Marcus lay on the trail for a full minute, his chest heaving, before he finally pushed himself to his feet. His hands were shaking. When he looked back at the jungle where the phantom riders had been, he saw only trees and gathering darkness. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. The time read 6:27 p.m. Only 12 minutes had passed since he'd first noticed the silence. Marcus didn't walk back to the trailhead. He ran, his rational mind completely shattered, and he didn't stop running until he was out of the reserve and standing under the bright, reassuring glow of a streetlight on Rifle Range Road. Marcus never went back to the Bukit Timah Reserve. 2 days later, still deeply shaken, he found himself at the Central Library, pulling up historical records of the Malayan campaign. He needed to understand what he'd experienced, even if he couldn't explain it. That is when he found the accounts from British and Australian soldiers describing the sound of the Japanese bicycle advance, the metallic clattering, the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once, the psychological terror of hearing that sound approach, knowing what it meant. He also found something else, dozens of reports over the years from hikers, joggers, and park rangers who'd heard the same thing he had. The metallic rattling near sunset, the sudden cold, the overwhelming sense of being surrounded by something moving through the jungle with relentless purpose. One account from a British expat in 1967 described seeing shadows on wheels near the Old Kranji area. Another, from a Singaporean student in 1989, mentioned the smell of gun oil and canvas. A park ranger's report from 2003 noted unusual sounds consistent with metal on stone near the old pillbox defensive line, though the report was filed and quickly dismissed. Marcus sat in the library until closing, reading account after account, and understood something profound: the emotional energy of that advance. The terror of the defenders and the fanatical determination of the attackers had been so intense, so concentrated, that it had somehow burned itself into the land. Those soldiers, those ghostly riders on their skeletal bicycles, weren't malevolent. They weren't trying to harm anyone. They were trapped in a loop, eternally reliving those fevered days in February 1942 when they rode through impossible terrain at impossible speed, breaking through a defensive line that was supposed to hold forever. The bicycle blitz had been so shocking, so unexpected, so psychologically devastating that its echo never truly faded. On certain evenings when the light is right and the air is still, the jungle remembers. And if you are unlucky enough to be there when it does, you'll hear them coming through the trees. The phantom battalion that shattered an empire's illusion of invincibility. Marcus transferred back to the San Jose office within 6 weeks. When his colleagues asked why, he simply said the climate didn't agree with him. He never mentioned what he'd experienced in the jungle, except once. In an email to Sarah, "You were right," he wrote. "Some sounds never stop echoing. While the jungles still echo with the sound of the approach, the true nightmares began when the front lines collapsed into the city itself." The bicycle blitz was terrifying, yes, but it was just the beginning. Once the Japanese forces breached Singapore Island, the fighting became desperate, chaotic, and brutal. The rules of war, the conventions meant to protect the innocent, began to break down. In our next story, we explore a place meant for healing, a sanctuary that should have been off limits to violence. But in the fog of war, in the chaos of a collapsing defensive line, terrible things happen. And when they happen in a place dedicated to mercy and compassion, the spiritual wound cuts even deeper. We're going to the Alexandra Hospital, where on Valentine's Day 1942, the day before the official surrender, the unthinkable occurred. Where white coats turned red. Where the corridors meant for healing became corridors of slaughter. Some say those corridors still run red. Not with physical blood, that has long since been scrubbed away, but with something else, something that stains deeper than any physical substance. Welcome to the Red Corridors of Alexandra, Story 2. The Red Corridors of Alexandra. Before we descend into this particular horror, you need to understand the rules of war. Even in the darkest conflicts, there are supposed to be lines that cannot be crossed. One of those lines is absolute hospitals are off limits. The Geneva Conventions, established after World War I, make this crystal clear. Medical facilities, marked with red crosses, are to be respected as neutral ground. Wounded soldiers, medical staff, even enemy soldiers being treated. All are to be left unharmed. This isn't just morality, it is strategic pragmatism. If hospitals aren't safe, if doctors can't trust that they'll be protected while treating the wounded, then the entire system of military medicine collapses. Soldiers know that if they're injured, they can be evacuated to a hospital and receive care. That knowledge allows them to fight, take it away. And the psychological foundation of any military force crumbles. The Alexandra Hospital, located on Alexandra Road in southern Singapore, was one such sanctuary. A sprawling complex of white buildings with red crosses prominently displayed on the roof. It was treating hundreds of wounded British, Australian, and Indian soldiers in mid-February 1942. As the Japanese advanced deeper into Singapore Island, the hospital became increasingly crowded. Surgical teams worked around the clock. Nurses moved between beds in a constant dance of triage, pain management, and desperate attempts to save lives. On the 13th of February, the hospital staff could hear the fighting getting closer. Artillery shells whistled overhead. Small arms fire echoed through the streets. But the hospital was clearly marked. It flew the Red Cross flag. Its neutrality was supposed to be guaranteed by international law. On the 14th of February, 1942, Valentine's Day, ironically, Japanese forces reached the hospital. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and horrific events of the fall of Singapore. The facts are disputed. Japanese accounts claim there was firing from the hospital, that soldiers in British uniform were using it as a defensive position. British accounts vehemently deny this, stating the hospital was clearly marked and was treating only wounded men. What is not disputed is what happened next. Japanese soldiers entered the hospital. According to survivor testimony, they bayoneted doctors in mid-surgery. Nurses were killed as they tried to protect their patients. Wounded soldiers, some still lying on operating tables, were murdered. One doctor, Lieutenant Colonel Craven, was bayoneted while holding surgical instruments. A total of approximately 50 medical staff and 200 patients were killed, many by bayonet. The survivors, about 200 men, were herded into cramped quarters and held overnight without food, water, or medical attention. The next morning, the 15th of February, they were marched out in groups and executed. The Alexandra Hospital Massacre, as it became known, was a profound violation of the laws of war. It was, by any definition, a war crime. The few survivors carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And according to many who've worked in or visited the area in the decades since, the hospital itself carried scars too. Scars that never healed. Jennifer Tan had been a nurse for 8 years before taking the position at the Alexandra Community Hospital. The modern facility, built in the 1990s on part of the original Alexandra Hospital grounds, was known for being a good place to work. The pay was decent, the shifts were manageable, and the administration actually seemed to care about staff well-being. The only catch was that the oldest wing, Block 7, a preserved section of the original 1940s hospital building kept for historical purposes, gave everyone the creeps. "You'll get used to it," her supervisor had said during orientation. "It is just old, lots of history. Some people find it atmospheric." Atmospheric was putting it mildly. Block 7 looked like something out of a period horror film. While the rest of the hospital was bright, modern, and sterile, Block 7 maintained its original architecture. Narrow corridors with high ceilings, small windows with heavy frames, and that distinctive colonial-era feel. The paint was fresh, and the floors were clean, but there was something about the proportions, the way sounds echoed, that felt fundamentally wrong. The block was mostly used for storage now, plus a few administrative offices during the day. At night, it was supposed to be empty, locked, off limits to everyone except security. Jennifer's first few months went smoothly. She worked the night shift in the modern ICU wing, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and rarely had reason to think about Block 7. It was on the other side of the campus, connected by a covered walkway, but essentially separate. Then, in mid-February, she'd later realize it was almost exactly 80 years to the day after the massacre. The hospital had a staffing emergency. A flu outbreak had decimated the night shift roster, and they needed bodies wherever they could find them. Jennifer was temporarily reassigned to patient monitoring, which meant sitting at a central nursing station and keeping an eye on several wards via CCTV and alarm systems. The nursing station for the monitoring duty was located in Block 7. "It is really easy," her exhausted supervisor explained. "You are basically just watching screens. If an alarm goes off, you call the appropriate ward. The actual patient care is being handled by the ward nurses. You are just the central hub for one night, maybe two if we can't get anyone else." Jennifer wanted to protest, but the supervisor looked like she was about to collapse. "Fine," Jennifer said, "one night. But someone brings me coffee at 3 a.m., or I am not responsible for what happens." The supervisor managed a tired smile. "Deal. The key to Block 7 is in the security office. They'll let you in around 10:30 p.m. Your shift starts at 11. That night, Jennifer collected the key from a security guard who seemed surprised she was willing to work in Block 7 alone. "You sure?" he asked. "We can probably rig something up in the main building. It is fine." Jennifer said, with more confidence than she felt, "It is just one night. How bad can it be?" The guard gave her a look that suggested it could be very bad indeed, but he handed over the key. "Call if you need anything. Extension 999, and," he hesitated, "if you hear weird stuff, it is just the old pipes. The whole block has plumbing issues." Noted, Jennifer said, taking the key. She unlocked Block 7 at 10:45 p.m. and stepped inside. The lighting was dimmer than she expected. The fluorescent tubes in the ceiling were old, and several were flickering. Her footsteps echoed loudly on the tile floor as she walked down the main corridor toward the nursing station. The air felt different in here, colder maybe, or just stale, like a room that wasn't opened often enough. She could smell something faintly chemical, not the usual hospital antiseptic smell, but something older, almost like ether. But hospitals hadn't used ether as an anesthetic in decades. The nursing station was a small room about halfway down the main corridor. It had been updated with modern equipment, several computer monitors showing camera feeds from various wards, a phone system, a small desk with a comfortable chair. Someone had even left her a thermos of coffee, still hot, with a post. It note, "Hang in there, admin." Jennifer settled into the chair and pulled up the monitoring system. Everything looked normal. Patients sleeping quietly, a few nurses moving between rooms, the soft beeps and hums of medical equipment. Just a normal night in a hospital. She checked her watch. 11:02 p.m., 6 hours to go. At 11:17 p.m., one of the monitors flickered. Jennifer looked up from her phone. She'd been scrolling through social media. Because watching sleeping patients on camera wasn't exactly riveting and frowned, the camera for Ward 4C was showing static. She picked up the phone and dialed Ward 4C. "Hey, this is monitoring. Your camera just went out." "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," a tired-sounding nurse replied. "Patients are all stable. Camera's been glitchy for weeks. We've reported it." "Okay, I'll make a note. Call if you need anything." Jennifer hung up and made a note in the log. Ward 4C camera malfunction. Ward reports all stable. At 11:34 p.m., she smelled it again. That strange, old-fashioned chemical smell. Stronger this time, it made her slightly dizzy, like inhaling something she shouldn't. She stood up and walked to the door of the nursing station. Looking down the corridor, empty, just the flickering fluorescent lights and the long stretch of old tile floor. "Old building smells," she muttered to herself. Totally normal. But her heart was beating faster. At 12:03 a.m., a call button lit up on her monitoring board. Room 7 to 14. She frowned. Room 7 to 14 was in Block 7. In fact, it was down the corridor from where she was sitting. But Block 7 didn't have any patients. It was storage and offices. She stared at the light for a few seconds, then picked up the phone to call security. The line was dead. She tried again. Nothing. Not even a dial tone. "Great," she said aloud. Her voice sounded too loud in the small room. The call button for room 7 to 14 was still lit. Jennifer stood up, grabbed a flashlight from the desk drawer. Every nursing station had emergency equipment, and walked out into the corridor. The lights seemed dimmer than before. More of them were flickering now, creating a strobing effect that made her slightly nauseous. She walked down the corridor toward room 7 to 14. The door had an old-fashioned window in it, thick glass reinforced with wire mesh. Through it, she could see a dark room. The call button, light above the door, was glowing steadily. "Hello," Jennifer called out, her hand on the door handle. "Is someone in there?" No response, just the hum of the flickering lights. She tried the handle locked. Of course it was locked. The room was supposed to be empty storage. The call button light went out. Jennifer stood there for a moment, her flashlight beam illuminating the wire, mesh glass of the door. Through it, she could just make out shapes, stacked boxes, old filing cabinets. Nothing that could press a call button. Old wiring, she told herself. Just like the guard said, old building, old systems, everything's glitchy. She turned to walk back to the nursing station. That is when she heard it, a sound from further down the corridor, from the direction she hadn't explored yet, the old surgical wing. It sounded like boots, heavy boots on tile, multiple pairs walking in rhythm, coming closer. Jennifer froze. "Security," she called out. "Is that you?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No humming lights, no distant sounds from other parts of the hospital, just dead, oppressive silence. Then, from very close, too close, she heard a voice. A man's voice, speaking with a British accent, panicked and desperate. There in the building. There in the bloody building. Jennifer spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping the corridor. There was no one there. Who said that? She demanded, her voice shaking. Who is there? Another voice, different, also British. Get the patients to the back. Move, move. The voices were all around her, echoing off the walls, but the corridor was empty. There was no one there. The temperature dropped. Jennifer's breath came out in visible puffs. The chemical smell, ether, iodine, old blood, became overwhelming. And then the corridor changed. It happened so fast, Jennifer didn't have time to process it. The modern, clean, if outdated hallway seemed to ripple like heat haze over asphalt. The paint on the walls darkened, peeled, revealed older paint beneath. The flickering fluorescent lights became dim incandescent bulbs in fixtures she didn't recognize. The tile floor looked scuffed, stained. She was no longer in the present. The corridor had transformed into its 1942 self. "No," Jennifer whispered. "No, no, no." Doors along the corridor flew open, not slowly, not one at a time, but all at once, slamming against the walls with sounds like gunshots. Through the open doors, Jennifer could see shapes moving, shadows of beds, of people running, of chaos. The sounds hit her like a physical wave, screaming. Men screaming in pain, in terror. Boots pounding on the floor, shouted commands in a language she didn't understand, Japanese. Her mind supplied, that is Japanese. The crashing of equipment being overturned, the wet, horrible sound of impact, of steel entering flesh. Jennifer tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, watching in horror as the ghostly scene played out around her. A phantom nurse materialized at the far end of the corridor. She was young, wearing an old-fashioned white uniform and cap. Her face was a mask of absolute terror. She ran toward Jennifer, her mouth open in a silent scream. Jennifer wanted to move, wanted to get out of the way, but she couldn't. The phantom nurse ran directly through her. The sensation was indescribable. A wave of pure, distilled fear crashed through Jennifer's body. She felt the nurse's terror as if it were her own. The desperate need to escape, the horror of what was happening behind her, the knowledge that she was going to die. Jennifer gasped, stumbling backward. The phantom nurse kept running, passing through the closed door at the end of the corridor and vanishing. But she was replaced immediately by something worse. A shadow figure, wearing what looked like a military uniform and helmet, appeared where the nurse had been. It was holding something. Jennifer's mind didn't want to recognize it as a bayonet, but that is what it was. The blade was dark, with something that might have been old blood. The shadow soldier moved down the corridor with mechanical precision, entering each room in turn. From each room came sounds Jennifer would never be able to forget, pleading in British accents, the sound of struggle, wet impacts, cut-off screams. "Stop," Jennifer tried to say, but no sound came out. "Stop." The shadow soldier turned to look at her. Its face was a void, a darkness so deep it seemed to pull light into it. But she felt its gaze, felt the absolute absence of mercy, the mechanical execution of orders, the dehumanizing efficiency of military violence taken to its darkest extreme. It took a step toward her. Raising the bayonet, Jennifer found her voice and screamed. The sound shattered something. The corridor snapped back to reality, like a rubber band releasing. The modern paint, the fluorescent lights, the clean floors, everything returned in an instant. The shadow soldier was gone. The sounds were gone, but Jennifer could still smell the blood and ether, could still feel the nurse's terror imprinted on her nervous system. She ran, simply turned, and sprinted back to the nursing station, her footsteps echoing in the now empty corridor. She grabbed her bag, not bothering with the computers or the logs or anything else, and ran for the exit. The door to Block 7 seemed impossibly far away, but she reached it, fumbled with the lock, and burst out into the covered walkway. The warm Singapore night air hit her like a blessing. She could hear traffic in the distance, could see the lights of the modern hospital buildings. She was back in the present. She was safe. Jennifer stood in the walkway, shaking until a security guard found her 20 minutes later. She was sitting on a bench, still trembling, unable to form coherent sentences. Jennifer called in sick for the next 3 days. When she finally returned to work, she demanded, a transfer to day shift only in the modern wings. Her supervisor, looking at Jennifer's pale face and haunted eyes, didn't ask questions. The transfer was approved immediately. Jennifer never set foot in Block 7 again, but she did research. Once she could handle it. Once the nightmares had faded enough that she could think about what she'd experienced without panicking, she went to the National Archives and read everything she could find about the Alexandra Hospital massacre. The accounts matched what she'd experienced: the chaos, the terror, the nurses trying to protect their patients, the violation of every rule of war. She also found something else. She wasn't alone. Over the decades, dozens of people had reported similar experiences in Block 7. Security guards refusing to patrol alone at night, cleaning staff quitting rather than work in certain areas, a maintenance worker in 2001 who reported seeing a nurse covered in blood running down a corridor only to have her vanish. The hospital administration had quietly kept records of these incidents, though they were never made public. Jennifer got access to them through a sympathetic archivist. The pattern was clear. The phenomena intensified around the 14th of February each year, and always occurred in areas that had been part of the original hospital building. Places of immense trauma, Jennifer learned, can act like spiritual recording devices. The emotional energy of extreme events, particularly sudden, violent death accompanied by profound injustice, can imprint itself on physical space. The Alexandra Hospital massacre had been so horrific, so unexpected, such a violation of the sanctuary that hospitals are supposed to represent, that it had left a wound in reality itself. The ghosts of Alexandra weren't haunting out of malice. They were trapped, eternally reliving that terrible day, unable to move forward, unable to escape. The nurses still tried to protect their patients. The patients still begged for mercy, and the shadow soldiers still carried out their orders, mechanical and remorseless. Jennifer eventually left Alexandra Community Hospital entirely. She transferred to a newer facility across the island, somewhere with no history, no ghosts, no echoes of 1942. But she never forgot what she'd experienced, and she never stopped believing that some wounds run too deep to heal, that some horrors echo through time, playing over and over again like a tape that no one can stop. If you ever visit Singapore, you can still see the preserved Alexandra Hospital Chapel, maintained as a memorial to those who died. It is a quiet, peaceful place. The hospital administration encourages visits during the day. But whatever you do, don't go there at night, especially not in February, and especially not on the 14th. Some corridors still run red, even if the blood has long since been scrubbed away. On the 15th of February, one day after the Alexandra Hospital massacre, Lieutenant General Percival signed the surrender. At 5:15 p.m., the firing stopped. After 70 days of fighting down the Malayan Peninsula and a week of brutal combat on Singapore Island itself, it was over. But for the 130,000 Allied soldiers who survived the battle, the nightmare was only beginning. They had laid down their arms expecting to be treated as prisoners of war, expecting to be housed in camps with adequate food and medical care, expecting to be protected under the Geneva Conventions. What they got instead was Changi. Changi prison and the surrounding camps became a hellish purgatory. Built to house 600 inmates, it would eventually hold over 5,000 prisoners of war, with tens of thousands more in sprawling, makeshift camps nearby. The conditions were beyond inhumane. Men were given starvation rations, a handful of rice, perhaps a thin soup, maybe a few vegetables. Diseases ran rampant: dysentery, beriberi, malaria, dengue fever. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent, and those who were strong enough were sent out on forced labor details to build railways, roads, and airfields under the blazing tropical sun. Thousands died, some from disease, some from starvation, some from the brutal conditions of forced labor, but many more simply wasted away, their bodies consuming themselves, their spirits breaking under the relentless grind of captivity. They say that when people die slowly, when their suffering is prolonged and profound, they leave something behind, a spiritual residue, an echo of their misery. At Changi, that echo has never faded. Our third story takes us behind the walls of the infamous Changi prison, where the largest surrender in British history led to unimaginable torment, where 130,000 men learned that surviving the battle was, in many ways, worse than dying in it. Welcome to the Starving Shadows of Changi, Story 3, The Starving Shadows of Changi. To understand Changi, you need to understand what it meant to be a prisoner of war under the Imperial Japanese military during World War II. The Japanese military code, heavily influenced by Bushido principles, held that surrender was the ultimate shame. A soldier who surrendered had forfeited his honor, his humanity, his right to be treated with dignity. From the Japanese perspective, a prisoner of war was already dead, or worse than dead. They were non-people deserving of nothing but contempt. This wasn't just cultural difference. It was official policy. The Japanese military had never signed the 1929 Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners of war. They didn't consider themselves bound by its provisions, and even if they had, the sheer logistical challenge of housing 130,000 prisoners on an island that was now cut off from supplies would have made humane treatment difficult. The result was catastrophic. Changi Prison, located on the eastern end of Singapore Island, became the central hub of this nightmare. The prison itself was overcrowded beyond belief. Men slept pressed against each other on concrete floors. Sanitation was a joke. Latrines overflowed. Disease spread like wildfire, and the smell was reportedly unbearable. But Changi Prison was actually the better option. The sprawling camp area around it was worse. Makeshift barracks made from bamboo and palm leaves. No running water, no medical facilities worthy of the name. Men died daily from preventable diseases. The dead were buried in mass graves, often with minimal ceremony, because there simply wasn't time or energy for more. The rations were criminal. A prisoner might receive 600 calories a day, less than a quarter of what a man needs to maintain body weight. The rice was often rotten or infested with weevils. The thin vegetable soup was more water than vegetables. Protein was almost non-existent. Men's bodies began to cannibalize themselves, muscle wasting away, organs failing. And then there was the labor. Thousands of prisoners were sent to work on the infamous Burma Railway, the Death Railway, where an estimated 12,000 Allied POWs died building a supply line through impossible jungle terrain. Those who remained at Changi were used for local construction projects, hauling materials in the blazing heat with no adequate food, water, or rest. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical. Many men lost hope. They stopped believing they would ever see home again. Some simply gave up, and once a man gave up, he died quickly. The prisoners called it going around the bend, a point of no return where the body and spirit simply shut down. From 1942 to 1945, Changi was a living death. And when the war finally ended and the surviving prisoners were liberated, they left behind thousands of ghosts. Literally and figuratively, Tyler Morrison had always been fascinated by dark history. As a 28-year-old American travel blogger specializing in historical tourism, he'd visited battlefields, concentration camps, and memorial sites across the world. His YouTube channel, Walking Through History, had over 200,000 subscribers who appreciated his respectful, educational approach to difficult subjects. When Tyler planned his Southeast Asia trip, Changi was high on his list. The Changi Chapel and Museum, established to commemorate the POW experience, was supposed to be excellent, moving, well, curated, and respectful. He'd scheduled a full afternoon there, planning to film some footage for his channel. What he hadn't planned on was staying after closing. It was an accident. Really, Tyler had gotten absorbed in the exhibits, particularly the replica barracks and the original murals painted by POW Stanley Warren. He was in a quiet corner of the museum, filming a piece to camera about the resilience of the human spirit when he noticed the light changing. He checked his watch, 6:15 p.m. The museum closed at 6 o'clock. "Shit," he muttered, cutting the recording. He quickly packed up his camera gear and hurried toward the exit, expecting to find a guard waiting to politely kick him out. But the museum was empty. The lights in the main exhibition area had been dimmed to their after-hours setting. The front doors were locked. Tyler tried his phone. No signal. The thick walls of the museum blocked it. He walked back through the exhibition space, looking for a staff member. "A security guard, anyone, hello?" he called out. "Hey, I am really sorry. I lost track of time. Can someone let me out?" No response. Just the hum of air conditioning and the dim lighting. Tyler felt the first flicker of unease. He'd been in museums after hours before. It happened to travel bloggers sometimes, and staff were usually quick to find and escort out stragglers. But this place felt empty, more than empty, abandoned. He walked toward the administrative offices, still calling out. The corridor leading to the offices was darker than the exhibition space. The air felt different here, heavier somehow. That is when the feeling hit him. It started as a pressure in his chest, like someone was pressing down on his rib cage. Then it expanded, filling his entire body with a sensation he'd never experienced before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was deeper than fear. It was despair, absolute crushing despair. Tyler stopped walking. His breath came in short gasps. The feeling intensified, becoming almost unbearable. It was like drowning, like being buried alive. Like every bad feeling he'd ever had compressed into a single moment and amplified 100-fold. "What the hell?" he gasped, leaning against the wall for support. The temperature in the corridor dropped. Tyler could see his breath, and beneath the hum of the air conditioning, he heard something else. The faint sound of metal scraping metal, like cups being dragged across bars, and beneath that, something worse, the sound of dragging footsteps. Slow and shuffling, the gait of someone who barely had the strength to walk. Tyler's unease transformed into genuine fear. He pushed off the wall and started back toward the exhibition area, his camera bag bouncing against his hip. The sounds grew louder, the scraping metal, the shuffling steps, and now something else, the sound of labored breathing, of wet coughs, of whispered words in British and Australian accents. "Can't go on, water, need water. Mum, I want to go home." Tyler broke into a run. The exhibition area was just ahead. He burst through the doorway and stopped. The museum had changed. The carefully curated exhibits were gone. The clean, modern walls had transformed into rough concrete and bamboo. The dim after. Howard's lighting had become harsh sunlight streaming through gaps in a thatched roof. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, latrine pits, and rot. Tyler was standing in a barracks, and it was occupied. Shadowy figures lay on bare concrete floors, impossibly thin, their skeletal forms barely recognizable as human. Some were sitting, staring at nothing with hollow eyes. Others were lying motionless, and Tyler couldn't tell if they were sleeping or dead. One of the figures turned its head to look at him. It had no face, just a shadow where a face should be, a void that seemed to absorb light. But Tyler felt its gaze, felt the weight of its stare, and with that gaze came a wave of sensation. Hunger so intense, it felt like his stomach was consuming itself, thirst that made his throat feel like sandpaper, and an overwhelming longing for home so powerful, it brought tears to his eyes. "I am sorry," Tyler heard himself say. "I am so sorry." More figures began to turn toward him, dozens of them, their faceless heads swiveling in his direction, and with each one came another wave of emotion: despair, hunger, homesickness, the desperate desire for the suffering to just end. Tyler fell to his knees, overwhelmed. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, and he didn't know why, except that the grief and suffering around him was so profound, it was impossible not to absorb it. One of the shadow figures stood. It was painfully slow, as if every movement required immense effort. The figure shuffled toward Tyler, its emaciated form barely substantial. It stopped directly in front of him. Tyler looked up. The figure was reaching out with one shadowy hand, and even though it had no face, Tyler could feel what it was trying to communicate. Not malice, not anger, just acknowledgement. The desperate need to be seen, to be remembered, to not be forgotten. "I won't forget," Tyler whispered. "I promise I won't forget you." The shadow figure's hand touched Tyler's shoulder. The sensation was like ice water flowing through his veins. Every nerve in his body lit up with cold. He felt the figure's suffering in that moment. Every day of hunger, every night of homesickness, every moment of degradation and lost hope. It was unbearable. And then, mercifully, it ended. Tyler blinked. He was kneeling on the floor of the modern museum exhibition area. The lights were back to their normal after-hours dimness. The shadow figures were gone. The smell of unwashed bodies and rot had vanished. But his shoulder still felt cold where the phantom had touched him, and his face was still wet with tears. A security guard found him 10 minutes later, still kneeling on the floor, staring at nothing. Sir, are you all right?" The guard knelt beside him. "How did you get locked in here?" Tyler looked at the guard. "They're still here," he said, his voice hoarse. "They never left." The guard's expression shifted from concern to something else, understanding maybe, or recognition. "You saw them," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question," Tyler nodded. The guard helped Tyler to his feet. "Come on, let's get you outside." As they walked toward the exit, the guard spoke quietly. "You are not the first. Happens every few months. Someone stays too late or comes too close to the old prison grounds at night. The shadows, they don't mean harm. They just want to be remembered." "I'll remember," Tyler said. "God, I'll never forget." Tyler didn't post any video from Chanji. Couldn't. Every time he tried to review the footage he'd taken before closing, he broke down. The historical facts were one thing. He could recite them, could explain the conditions, could detail the suffering. But having felt it, having experienced even a fraction of what those men endured for years, was something else entirely. He spent 3 days in his hotel room, barely eating, haunted by what he'd experienced. The ghost's touch had left more than just a cold sensation. It had left an imprint. Tyler found himself waking up in the middle of the night with overwhelming hunger, even after eating dinner. Found himself desperately homesick for Austin, Texas, even though he'd been excited about traveling just days before. The ghost had shared its suffering with him, just a fraction of it, just enough to ensure Tyler would truly understand. And he did. Oh God, he did. Tyler eventually made it back to the United States. He never finished his Southeast Asia series. Couldn't. Instead, he posted a single video about Changi. No footage of the museum, no dramatic narration, just Tyler sitting in his apartment, speaking directly to the camera about what he'd experienced and what it meant. The ghosts of Changi aren't malevolent, he said in that video. They're not trying to scare anyone. They're just trapped in their suffering, in their hunger, in their longing for home. They died slowly, over months and years, and that slow death left an imprint. If you ever visit Changi, please be respectful. Remember that over 12,000 men died in captivity in Singapore and the surrounding labor camps. Remember that their suffering was prolonged and profound. And if you see the shadows, just acknowledge them. Let them know they're not forgotten. The video got over 1 million views. Hundreds of people commented with their own experiences at Changi, family members who'd felt the oppressive despair, tourists who'd seen the shadow figures, locals who refused to go near the old prison grounds after dark. Tyler never returned to Singapore, but he kept his promise. He never forgot. And through his testimony, through the 1 million people who watched his video and read the comments, the men of Changi were remembered. That is all the ghosts wanted. Not revenge, not to spread fear, just to be remembered, to have their suffering acknowledged, to not be forgotten by history. The starving shadows of Changi still shuffle through the grounds on quiet nights, still experience the eternal hunger, the desperate homesickness, the slow erosion of hope. They're trapped in the worst moments of their lives, unable to move forward. But they're not alone, they're remembered. And perhaps, in some small way that matters, while the prisoners suffered in the East, beneath the heart of the city, the architects of this massive defeat left their own spectral mark. The fall of Singapore wasn't just a military defeat. It was a command failure of staggering proportions. Deep below Fort Canning Hill, in a bunker designed to be bomb-proof and secure, British commanders made a series of decisions that would lead to the largest surrender in British military history. In those cramped, windowless rooms, the weight of impossible choices pressed down on men who'd been assured this fortress could never fall. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, in particular, bore that weight. He was the man who had to decide when to surrender, when to sacrifice the fortress to save the city from total destruction. He was the man who had to walk into a meeting with General Yamashita and sign away the British Empire's prestige in Asia. The bunker where he made that decision is still there, 9 meters below the surface. It is called the Battle Box, and it has been preserved as a museum. Visitors can walk through the communications room, the cipher room, the operations room, where the final decision was made. But some visitors report that they're not walking through an empty museum. Some report that the command staff never truly left, that on quiet nights, when the tourists are gone and the bunker is sealed, the ghosts of defeat still argue about water supplies and ammunition shortages, still grapple with the impossible choice of when to surrender. For our final story, we descend into the claustrophobic darkness of the underground command center. We're going 9 meters below Fort Canning Hill into the battle box, where the whispers of broken men still echo through the concrete corridors. Story 4, The Whispers of the Battle Box Command, is a burden that few can truly understand. When you are responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of men, when every decision you make could mean the difference between life and death, the psychological weight can be crushing. Now imagine that burden compounded by the knowledge that you are losing, that despite every tactical decision, despite the bravery of your men, despite all your training and experience, the battle is slipping away from you, that the fortress you were assured was impregnable is falling. And then add one more element. You know that surrender means not just military defeat, but the destruction of your nation's prestige. That you will be the man who lost the jewel of the empire. That your name will be associated with the worst disaster in your country's military history. That was the burden Lieutenant General Arthur Percival carried in February 1942. The battle box, located 9 meters below Fort Canning Hill in the center of Singapore, was the nerve center of the British defense. Built to be bomb-proof, it was a complex of over 20 rooms connected by narrow corridors, communications rooms with radios and telephone systems, cipher rooms for encoding and decoding messages, an operations room with a large map table where officers tracked troop movements, sleeping quarters for key personnel, all of it underground, windowless, ventilated by mechanical systems, lit by electric lights that never went out. It was meant to be a command center from which Percival could coordinate the defense of Singapore. Instead, it became a tomb where he watched the defense collapse. By the 13th of February, the situation was desperate. Water supplies were running low. The Japanese had captured the reservoirs. Ammunition was being rationed. The civilian population was in danger as Japanese artillery pounded the city center. Percival's commanders were giving him increasingly dire reports. The front lines were dissolving. Units were out of communication. Casualties were mounting. On the 14th of February, Percival received word of the Alexandra Hospital massacre, the breakdown of military discipline, the violation of the rules of war. It was clear the situation was spiraling completely out of control, and on the 15th of February, in the battle box, Percival made the decision to surrender. At 9:30 a.m., he sent a message to Japanese headquarters requesting a ceasefire. At 5:15 p.m. at the Ford Motor Factory on Bukit Timah Road, he signed the surrender document. 130,000 men laid down their arms. The impregnable fortress fell, and Percival's name went into the history books as the commander who presided over Britain's worst military disaster. The psychological weight of that decision, the knowledge that he was surrendering when some of his officers still wanted to fight, the burden of all those men who would become prisoners, the shame of failing to hold the fortress, was immense. Percival would spend the rest of his life defending his decision, arguing that surrender saved the city from complete destruction, that further resistance was pointless and would only lead to more deaths. But the doubt, the shame, the weight of command gone wrong, those never left him. And according to many who've worked in the battle box in the decades since, those feelings never left the bunker either. David Lim had been working as a maintenance technician for the Fort Canning Park Museums for 3 years. It was a good job, decent pay, interesting historical sites to maintain, and usually pretty straightforward work. Fix a light here. Address a plumbing issue there. Make sure the HVAC systems in the underground bunkers were functioning. The battle box was one of his regular assignments. Once a month, he'd do a full systems check, walk through all the rooms, test the lighting, make sure the ventilation was working, check for any signs of water infiltration or structural issues. Usually, he did it during the day between tour groups, but this month scheduling conflicts meant he had to do it after closing. Around 8 p.m., no problem, his supervisor had said. You've been down there dozens of times. Just do the checklist and lock up when you are done. David arrived at Fort Canning Hill just as the last tour group was leaving. He chatted briefly with the tour guide, a friendly woman named Rachel, who'd been giving tours of the battle box for years. You are doing maintenance tonight, she asked. Alone? Yea, why? Is that a problem? Rachel hesitated. No, it is fine. It is just the battle box is different at night. Some of the guides won't close up alone. They always buddy up. David laughed. Ghost stories? Come on, Rachel. I am a maintenance guy. I've been in every corner of that bunker. It is just old concrete and electrical systems. Sure, Rachel said, but she didn't sound convinced. Just, if anything feels off, don't be a hero. Come back up and wait for someone else. "I'll be fine," David assured her. He'd never been the type to believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. The world was physical, mechanical. Things that seemed spooky always had rational explanations. He unlocked the entrance to the battle box and descended the stairs. The temperature dropped as he went down, normal for underground spaces in tropical Singapore. The air conditioning kept the bunker at a steady 22 degrees Celsius to preserve the historical artifacts and wax figures used in the museum displays. David reached the bottom of the stairs and entered the first corridor. The lights were on their after-hours setting, dimmer than during the day but adequate for him to see. He pulled out his checklist and started his rounds. Communications room. Lights functional, ventilation working, no visible issues. Cipher room, same. Battery room. All equipment operating normally. He worked his way through the bunker methodically, checking each room, making notes. Everything was functioning as it should. Just another routine maintenance check. He was in one of the sleeping quarters when he first noticed the silence. The battle box was always quiet. Being 9 meters underground meant no outside sounds penetrated. But there was usually the constant hum of ventilation, the electrical buzz of lighting systems, normal building sounds. But now there was nothing. The silence was absolute, oppressive, like someone had turned off the world. David stood still, listening. The ventilation system had stopped. He could no longer hear the familiar hum. That wasn't good. The bunker needed active ventilation to prevent humidity issues. He walked toward the ventilation control room, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. But as he walked, he noticed something else. The air felt different, thicker, and there was a smell he didn't recognize, old cigarette smoke. But smoking had been banned in the bunker for decades. The lights flickered. David stopped. "Great," he muttered. "Electrical issue." The lights flickered again, then steadied. But they seemed dimmer now, or maybe it was his imagination. He reached the ventilation control room and checked the system. Everything looked normal. Gauges showed proper operation. The control panel indicated no faults. But he couldn't hear the fans running. A sound from behind him made David spin around. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A clicking sound, rhythmic like Morse code or a telegraph machine. "Hello," David called out. "Rachel, is that you? Did someone else come down?" No response, just that faint clicking. David left the ventilation room and followed the sound. It was coming from the communications room. He walked down the narrow corridor, the clicking getting louder with each step. The smell of cigarette smoke grew stronger, and beneath it, something else, sweat. The nervous sweat of stressed men. The air felt thick with it. David reached the communications room and looked inside. The room was set up as it had been in 1942, complete with wax figures of British officers at the radio and telephone stations. But something was wrong. The shadows in the room were moving, shifting independently of the light source, and the telegraph machine, an authentic piece from 1942, supposedly non-functional, was clicking away. David stepped into the room. The clicking stopped. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. "This is insane," David said aloud, his voice sounding flat in the dead air. "It is just old equipment, power surge or something." But his hands were shaking as he approached the telegraph machine. It was definitely off, no power running to it. The clicking had been impossible. Behind him, a voice spoke. "We need to surrender." David spun around. The room was empty except for the wax figures. But one of them, a figure dressed as a British officer, standing near the map table, seemed to have shifted position. Its head was turned slightly, as if looking at him. "Who said that?" David demanded. "This isn't funny." The lights cut out completely. David was plunged into absolute darkness. Not just the absence of light, but a darkness so profound it felt physical. Like being buried alive, he fumbled for his phone, pulled it out, activated the flashlight. The beam illuminated the communications room. All the wax figures had turned to face him. David's heart hammered in his chest. "No," he whispered. "No, that is not possible." The voice spoke again, right next to his ear. A man's voice, British accent, speaking in clipped, military tones, water supplies critical, ammunition at 20%, casualties unsustainable. We have to surrender. David stumbled backward, his phone light swinging wildly. The beam caught the doorway to the operations room. Shadows were moving in there, not cast by any light source, but moving on their own. Figures in military uniforms, gathered around the map table, their faces obscured by darkness. "Gentlemen, please," another voice said. This one was different, older, more authoritative, but carrying the weight of unbearable stress. "I need recommendations. Do we fight on, or do we negotiate terms?" The shadows around the table began arguing, their voices overlapped, creating a cacophony of desperation. The men can still fight. Fight with what? "We're out of ammunition. The civilians will be slaughtered if we don't surrender. Better to die fighting than to become prisoners. You don't know what you are asking. You haven't seen the wounded. We can't save them if we keep fighting." David tried to move toward the exit, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, forced to watch the ghostly scene play out. The older voice, Percival, David's mind supplied. "That has to be Percival," spoke again. "The decision is mine. I take full responsibility. We will request a ceasefire." The arguing stopped. The shadows around the table seemed to freeze. Then, one by one, they turned to look at David. The weight of their gazes was crushing. David felt what they had felt in that moment. The shame, the horror, the knowledge that they were failing, that despite everything, despite all their training and courage and sacrifice, they were about to surrender. That 130,000 men were about to become prisoners, because the fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen in a week. David felt tears streaming down his face. The emotional weight was unbearable. He tried to speak, to tell them it wasn't their fault, that they'd done what they could, but no words came out. One of the shadow figures stepped forward. It was the tallest one, the one with the older voice. Percival. As it approached, David felt a heavy, invisible hand on his shoulder. The sensation was like ice and fire at the same time, cold enough to burn. The shadow figure leaned close and whispered directly in David's ear. The voice was hollow, echoing, as if coming from very far away. "We have to surrender. Tell them we had no choice." The light snapped back on. David was standing alone in the operations room. The wax figures were in their normal positions, unmoving. The shadows were gone. The voices had stopped. But his shoulder still burned where the phantom hand had touched it, and his face was still wet with tears. David didn't finish the maintenance check. He turned and ran, sprinting through the corridors of the battle box, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. He took the stairs 2 at a time and burst out into the tropical night air, gasping. A security guard, making rounds, found him sitting on a bench outside the bunker entrance 15 minutes later, still shaking. "You okay, sir?" the guard asked. David looked up at him. "I am never going down there at night again." The guard nodded slowly. "You saw them? You know about them. Everyone who works here knows," the guard said quietly. "The command staff, they never left, still trying to figure out what else they could have done, still carrying the weight of that decision." David put in for a transfer the next day. He couldn't work in the battle box anymore, couldn't walk through those corridors knowing what was down there. His supervisor, understanding, moved him to other historical sites in the park. But David did something before he left. He went to the National Archives and read everything he could find about Lieutenant General Arthur Percival and the fall of Singapore. He needed to understand the decision that haunted the battle box. What he found was heartbreaking. Percival had been in an impossible position: fight on and watch the city be destroyed, the civilians slaughtered, the wounded denied any hope of treatment, or surrender and face the shame of presiding over Britain's worst military disaster. After the war, Percival had spent years defending his decision. He'd written books, given interviews, argued that surrender had saved Singapore from total destruction. But the criticism never stopped. Churchill had called it a disaster. Military historians debated whether he should have fought on. The public memory focused on the surrender, not the impossible circumstances that led to it. Percival died in 1966, but according to David's research, he never fully escaped the shadow of the 15th of February, 1942. The decision he'd made in the battle box had defined the rest of his life, and apparently it still defined his death. The ghosts in the battle box weren't malevolent. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They were just trapped in the worst moment of their lives, eternally reliving the decision to surrender, trying to justify it to themselves and anyone who would listen. Command is a burden, and sometimes that burden is so heavy it transcends death. David never went back to the battle box, but he made sure to tell people about what he'd experienced, to explain that the ghosts down there weren't monsters. They were men who'd been given an impossible choice and had made the best decision they could under horrific circumstances. If you visit the battle box, David would say, remember that it is not just a museum, it is a memorial to the weight of command, to the burden of making impossible decisions. And if you hear voices in the dark or feel a hand on your shoulder, just understand, they're still trying to explain, still trying to justify, still carrying that burden. The whispers of the battle box continue. On quiet nights, when the tourists are gone and the bunker is sealed, the ghostly command staff still gathers around the map table, still argues about water supplies and ammunition, still comes to the same terrible conclusion. They have to surrender. And the burden of that decision, the shame and the necessity intertwined, haunts them forever. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 wasn't just a shift in global power or a military defeat. It was a profound human tragedy that compressed immense violence, suffering, and despair into a shockingly brief period. In just 70 days, the Japanese swept down the Malayan Peninsula and shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia. In just 7 days after landing on Singapore Island, they forced the surrender of 130,000 Allied defenders. But what happens to all that emotional energy? What happens to the terror of the defenders hearing that metallic clattering approaching through the jungle? To the anguish of nurses trying to protect their patients as soldiers broke through hospital doors? To the despair of prisoners slowly starving behind the walls of Changi? To the crushing weight of commanders making impossible decisions in an underground bunker? According to the witnesses we've heard from today, that energy doesn't dissipate. It remains, imprinted on the land like a spiritual recording. The Phantom Bicycle Battalion still rides through the jungle near Bukit Timah. The corridors of Alexandra Hospital still run red with echoes of violence. The starving shadows of Changi still shuffle through their eternal hunger, and the whispers in the battle box still argue about surrender. These aren't malevolent hauntings. These ghosts aren't trying to harm the living. They're simply trapped in the worst moments of their lives, unable to move forward, eternally reliving the trauma of February 1942. The fall of Singapore left more than just historical records and memorials. It left a spiritual scar that has never fully healed, and for those sensitive enough to perceive it, or unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, that scar still bleeds. From the rattle of bicycle rims in the jungle to the despairing shadows of Changi, the 130,000 men who fell into darkness left behind a resonance that refuses to fade. They want to be remembered, need to be remembered. Because being forgotten is the final death worse than the physical death they endured. So which of these stories from the fall of Singapore chilled you the most? Was it the Phantom Blitz with its relentless riders on skeletal bicycles? The red corridors of Alexandria, where a sanctuary became a slaughterhouse? The starving shadows of Changi, trapped in eternal hunger? Or the whispers of the battle box, where the burden of command still weighs on ghostly shoulders? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I am genuinely curious which story resonated most with you. If you survived this journey into the dark history of the Pacific Theater, please hit that like button. It feeds the algorithm and keeps the ghosts at bay, or at least helps other people interested in historical hauntings find this content. Share this video with a friend who loves history and the paranormal. These stories deserve to be told, and the men who experienced these events deserve to be remembered. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode of Ghost Stories of the Battles. We'll be exploring more haunted battlefields, more spectral remnants of history's darkest conflicts, and more places where the past refuses to stay buried. Until next time, remember, history may be written by the victors, but the battlefields belong to the ghosts. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself in Singapore, walking through the jungle at dusk or visiting old military sites at night, pay attention to what you hear. Pay attention to what you feel, because sometimes the past reaches out to remind us that it is still here, still present, still demanding to be acknowledged. The fall of Singapore happened 82 years ago, but for some, it never truly ended. Stay safe out there.